You're listening to a series on the historicity of Jesus' resurrection. Most of the information in this series is drawn from Dr. Dale Allison's The Resurrection of Jesus, Apologetics, Polemics, History. You can find links to other episodes in this series, as well as his fantastic book, in the description. Last episode we talked about the historicity of several of the Christ apparitions after Easter, and our search yielded rather meager results. All we can really say so far is that soon after Jesus died, probably within a week, Mary Magdalene indeed saw an empty tomb. Soon after that, Mary reported seeing a vision of Jesus. Around that time, the Apostle Peter also reported seeing a vision that somehow led him to conclude Jesus had been resurrected. A wild belief that, as far as current research shows, would have been quite unusual for a Jew of his time to invent. Jesus also appeared to the 11 apostles, though the details of this apparition are scarce. What we do know is that some of his disciples doubted, a trend which John the Evangelist summarizes in the story of doubting Thomas. According to St. Paul, Jesus also appeared to more than 500 brothers, most of who were still alive at the time, as well as James and himself. We still need to go through these cases, but I can't help but think we're missing something. Last episode we concluded that Peter received a special vision from Jesus, but no details of that vision exist. Well, there is the story in John in which Peter apparently went back to his day job as a fisherman. You may know the story. Peter's catching nothing when a mysterious man on the shore tells him, "Cast your net back into the water one more time." The mysterious man's command works, and Peter catches the mother lode. It's a classic story. It's a shame it doesn't show up in any of the other Gospels, though. Given how it only appears in John, we are forced yet again to relegate this story to a dead end. Maybe there's a historical kernel, maybe not. But wait a second. Jesus appears to Peter, who's having a bad fishing day, tells him to cast his net into the water one more time. Jesus' plan works. Peter rushes to Jesus. Haven't we heard that story somewhere else before? Yes, Luke. Yes, there is a glimmer of hope for this story. As we've mentioned before, the Gospel writers took creative liberties in their placement of stories. Recall how John, for example, puts the cleansing of the temple at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, while every other Gospel puts it at the end. Before we figure out who has the correct placement, let's compare these two stories. In both Gospels, Peter is with the sons of Zebedee. In both Gospels, the disciples catch nothing after fishing all night. In both Gospels, Jesus is on the shore. He tells them to cast their nets. In both Gospels, the disciples obey and they get their payday, albeit the nets break in Luke, though not in John. Here's where things get interesting. The Peter in Luke responds to Jesus by falling down at Jesus' knees and insisting he is a sinner. The Peter in John atones for denying Jesus 3 times by professing his love 3 times. In both accounts, Peter calls Jesus Lord, and in both accounts, Peter follows Jesus. Folks, it sounds like we've got the same story taking place in 2 different times, and Dr. Allison seems to think that this happened after Easter. I personally love this because John's Gospel faces a lot of scrutiny since he wrote the last Gospel. Well, I guess as Jesus would say, the last shall be first. But why would Luke transfer this story to earlier in Jesus' ministry? Well, according to Dr. Allison, for Luke, the resurrection narrative takes place in Jerusalem, and he keeps it there for narrative reasons. But keeping the resurrection narrative strictly in Jerusalem contradicts what Matthew 28 and Mark 16 say. In Mark, the angel outside the tomb says to Mary, "But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Also in Mark, earlier, Jesus says, "But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." So in 2 Gospel passages, it is outright stated that Jesus will be in Galilee when he next sees the disciples. Luke, for narrative purposes most likely, doesn't mention anything about Galilee. So we have 3 sources, Mark, Matthew, and John, who say Jesus went to Galilee after his resurrection, and just 1 source, Luke, who omits any mention of Galilee. One more point. In Luke's fish-catching story, Jesus says to Peter, "From now on, you will catch people." This doesn't make any sense sequentially because Peter doesn't do this until after Jesus is resurrected. The evidence is abundant, guys. The fish catching story in Luke chapter 5 actually belongs after Mary Magdalene sees the empty tomb, and this is significant. As I'm about to explain, it means that I lied in the last episode. We actually do know when the first appearance to Peter was that Paul mentions. It was during this story. And there's a very simple explanation for why. As we all know, Peter's profession before Christ in his life was a fisherman. Dr. Allison asks this: if Jesus had appeared to Peter any sooner than this, why on earth would he go back to being a fisherman? Another thing to consider, although John states that this appearance was the third time he appeared to disciples, it does not specify which disciples. For all we know, Jesus had appeared 2 other times to different groups of people, including Mary Magdalene, before finally appearing to Peter. So here's how the story likely went. Mary Magdalene saw the empty tomb. Mary told Peter, who also may have seen it and, befuddled, returned home. Mary saw Jesus in a vision soon after. Jesus appeared to a group of unnamed disciples before then appearing to Peter on the shore of Galilee. The final piece of evidence that can put this sequence of events into clearer picture is from the Gospel of Peter, which says that after Jesus died, Peter and Andrew took their nets back to the sea. Along them were other disciples, and that's all we have. The text breaks off. Well, even if it isn't 100% certain, Dr. Allison finds the theory compelling, and so do I, for what it's worth. Next is the account of 500 brothers seeing Jesus. Here's where we hit a pretty solid dead end, just because the story is so vague. Could it be Pentecost Paul refers to? Well, Jesus wasn't there for that, though. There's just no way to tell, so we'll have to move on for now. What about James? First of all, who is James? Dr. Allison believes that this is James, the brother of Jesus, a title which in itself carries a lot of debate and controversy. St. Jerome mentions an event in which James, the possible brother of Jesus, essentially went on a hunger strike until he saw the risen Jesus. So Jesus, perhaps taking pity on his Schrodinger's brother, appears to him and eats with him. This account is from the Gospel of the Hebrews, which was probably written quite late, so its accuracy is very questionable. Still, this is the only account of a James we have to work with. We're running low on options, people, at this point. How about the Ascension? The oldest accounts of this grand event are in Pseudo-Mark, Luke, and Acts of the Apostles. The problem here is that Pseudo-Mark likely depends on Luke, basically summarizing him, and Acts was also written by Luke. So Luke is the only real source of information about the Ascension. In this account, we can clearly see Lucan theology and terminology obscuring any glimmer of a more ancient account. That's not to say the Ascension never happened, but as good detectives, we simply cannot include it in our ongoing list of events that most certainly happened. Another Lucan story of an apparition is Jesus' appearance to Saint Stephen the Martyr. Again, only Luke writes about this, so it's impossible to corroborate it. Let's turn our attention to Paul. Paul mentions his conversion experience several times between 1 Corinthians, Galatians, and Acts, which has the most detailed account. From these accounts, most of which Paul wrote himself, we know that Paul, who was named Saul, persecuted Christians. He was on the road to Damascus when he saw a light. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He responded, "Who are you, Lord?" The voice responded, "I am Jesus, who you are persecuting." The apostle rose, Saul changed his name to Paul, and dedicated his life to preaching Christianity to the Gentiles. Again, given how Paul wrote much of this himself, as well as Acts' corroboration of several details, it is safe to conclude that Paul's conversion was a historical event. There is one more vision that Dr. Allison briefly explores: John of Patmos, author of the book of Revelation. This book is so overloaded with symbolism, and it is not corroborated by any other text, so it is nearly impossible to extract a precise historical event from it. This is why there are so many theories regarding who exactly wrote this book and when they did. Okay, what results have we come up with so far? Shortly after Jesus died, Mary Magdalene went to check on the tomb. To her surprise, it was empty. She told Peter and possibly others about the empty tomb. Peter departed for Galilee, and somewhere around this time, Mary saw a vision of Jesus. Once Peter got to Galilee, he too saw a vision of Jesus. The most likely candidate for this first vision was when he was fishing on the Sea of Galilee. Something about this vision led Peter to conclude that Jesus had resurrected from the dead, which would have been a very strange belief to hold. Furthermore, this belief that Jesus had resurrected convinced the disciples that the end times had come. But Will, why would Jesus have gotten a hero's burial as a criminal? Didn't the Romans let the corpses rot on the crosses back in the day? Couldn't his body have been stolen? The answer to these questions will be explored in the next episodes. Until then, have a great day. God bless you.